In 1938, the last sea otter on the California coast was shot. The kelp forest vanished within a decade. Not because of fishing, not because of pollution, because without otters, sea urchins ate the kelp down to bare rock, and the entire underwater ecosystem, one of the most biodiverse on Earth, quietly collapsed. Biologists called it an urchin barren. Miles of seafloor scraped clean. $11 billion worth of fishery gone. In 1984, wildlife officers released 13 otters into Elkhorn Slough. Nobody was sure they'd survive. What those 13 animals did next, with nothing but their claws, a rock, and 400 million years of instinct, would change the coastline so completely that scientists tracking it said the results looked impossible. To understand what happened in 1984, you first have to understand what the California coast looked like before the fur trade arrived, and how completely humans erased it. Sea otters once ranged the entire Pacific Rim from Baja California north through Alaska and west across to Japan. Naturalists traveling with 18th century expeditions described coastlines so thick with otters that the animals appeared as a continuous dark ribbon along the waterline. Estimates from the early 1700s put the global population at somewhere between 150,000 and 300,000 animals. Then the Russian fur trade arrived in the Aleutian Islands in the 1740s, and within a generation, the hunting had spread south. British and American vessels joined the effort. Sea otter pelts were among the most valuable commodities on Earth. Dense, waterproof, almost impossibly soft. And the market in China paid extraordinary prices. By 1911, when an international treaty finally banned the hunting, the global population had been reduced to fewer than 2,000 animals, scattered in isolated pockets across a range that had once stretched for thousands of kilometers. The California population was considered commercially and functionally extinct. In less than 170 years, one of the ocean's most consequential predators had been erased from an entire coastline. What followed was not immediately obvious to anyone watching. The kelp was still there for a while. The urchins grazed at their usual pace. But the balance that had held for millennia was gone, and without it, the numbers quietly compounded in one direction. Urchins were always part of these ecosystems. With otters controlling their population, they stayed at densities the kelp could absorb, grazing on drift fronds, cycling nutrients, filling a functional role in the reef community without overwhelming it. The kelp forests that resulted were among the most productive marine habitats on Earth. Some canopies reached 30 meters from the seafloor to the surface, filtering light into shifting columns that marine biologists have compared to cathedral windows. Rockfish moved through the fronds in schools. Lingcod ambushed prey in the shadows at the base. Sea lions hunted along the canopy edge. Harbor seals rested in the surface drift. Hundreds of invertebrate species, snails, worms, crabs, nudibranchs, occupied every layer of the structure. The kelp forest was not decoration. It was the engine that powered everything around it. Without otters, the urchin population had no ceiling. A single female purple sea urchin releases up to 20 million eggs per spawning event. In the absence of predation pressure, the numbers compounded year over year. And urchins, when food is scarce, do not simply stop eating and wait. They enter a dormant grazing state. Pressing their five-toothed mouth structure, called Aristotle's lantern, against bare rock and scraping away at anything attached to it, including the holdfast that anchor kelp to the seafloor. Without its anchor, a kelp plant drifts free, dies, and sinks. By the mid-20th century, stretches of the California coast that had supported dense, layered kelp forest for thousands of years were reduced to flat purple carpets of starving urchins on bare rock. Biologists gave it a name that described exactly what it was: The urchin barren. The consequences moved up the food chain immediately. Rockfish populations in affected zones dropped. Abalone, which fed on kelp fragments that drifted to the seafloor, began disappearing from reefs that had supported them for generations. The commercial kelp harvest, used in food production, cosmetics, pharmaceuticals, and agricultural fertilizer, collapsed in affected areas. California's Department of Fish and Game began funding urchin culls in the 1960s. Dive teams descending to scrape urchins off the reef by hand or by hammer, removing them by the ton. It made no lasting difference. For every urchin removed, the surrounding population reproduced to fill the space within a single season. Artificial kelp structures were engineered and anchored to the seafloor to give holdfasts something to grip, or the urchins stripped them bare within months. A restoration project in Monterey County ran for 3 years, cost $340,000, and produced no measurable recovery of kelp canopy. The lesson was the same every time. You could not fix the kelp. The kelp was not the problem. In 1977, a discovery off the Big Sur coast changed the frame entirely. A small population of sea otters, an estimated 50 animals at the time of their discovery, grown from a remnant group that had survived undetected in the remote sea caves of the Central California cliffs, was confirmed by state biologists. By the late 1970s, that population had grown to around 1,800. Marine ecologist James Estes, who had spent much of the decade comparing otter-present and otter-absent zones in the Aleutian Islands, had by this point assembled a dataset that was difficult to argue with. In every zone where otters were present, urchin densities were low and kelp was abundant. In every zone without otters, the reverse held. It was not a correlation across a few sites. It held across thousands of kilometers of Pacific coastline, in every habitat type, in every year of his study. Estes called it a trophic cascade, the chain reaction that propagates through an entire ecosystem when a keystone predator is removed or reintroduced. His conclusion was straightforward. The urchin barren was a symptom. The missing otters were the disease. What that implied was uncomfortable for wildlife managers who had spent decades and millions of dollars on kelp restoration. The solution was not a new engineering program. It was not a better chemical treatment or a more efficient culling method. It was 13 animals in transport crates. So in 1984, the US Fish and Wildlife Service authorized a translocation. 13 sea otters were selected from the Big Sur population, health screened at the Monterey Bay Aquarium, fitted with radio transmitters attached to their hind flippers, and transported north to Elkhorn Slough, a tidal estuary near Moss Landing, south of Santa Cruz, that had been functionally devoid of otters for over a century. The release itself was unremarkable. No press event, no official ceremony. Wildlife biologist Ron Jameson and a small field team opened the transport boxes at the water's edge and watched the otters slip in. The first weeks were uncertain. 2 animals moved north of the release zone and had to be recaptured and returned. 3 others died from infections and injuries unrelated to the site, a mortality rate within the expected range for any translocation. The remaining 8 settled, and almost immediately they began to eat. A sea otter's metabolism runs extraordinarily fast. To maintain their body temperature in cold Pacific water, without the blubber that insulates other marine mammals, they burn calories at a rate that requires them to consume roughly 25% of their body weight in food every single day. For a 7-kilogram otter, that is close to 2 kilograms of prey daily. They dive to the seafloor, sometimes to depths of 30 meters, locate urchins by touch in rock crevices, wedge them free with their forepaws, and carry them to the surface tucked under their foreleg. Then they float on their backs, balance a flat rock on their chest, and crack the shell open with short, precise strikes, The sound is audible from a boat at distance, a sharp, hollow knock, repeated in rhythm. Watch one otter for an hour and you will see it make dozens of dives. Multiply that by 8 animals over a slough where urchin densities had been unchecked for decades, and the effect on the local urchin population was measurable within the first month of monitoring. Within 6 months, Jameson's team documented the first kelp regrowth in zones of heaviest otter foraging, not transplanted, not seeded. The holdfast had survived in the rock beneath the barren all along, dormant, attached, waiting for the grazing pressure to ease. When it did, the kelp grew back on its own. What followed over the next 2 decades was relentless, and to many of the scientists watching it, are genuinely surprising in its scope. Kelp canopy coverage in Elkhorn Slough expanded measurably year over year through the late 1980s and into the 1990s. The otter population grew alongside it, slowly at first, then faster as habitat quality improved and pup survival rates climbed. A nursing female otter carries her single pup on her chest while she dives, a behavior so metabolically demanding that she must eat close to 35% of her body weight daily to sustain it. Even so, the population compounded. By 1995, the California sea otter count stood at 2,377. By 2010, it exceeded 2,700. And wherever the otters moved along the coast, the sequence repeated. Urchin density dropped, kelp returned, and the species that depended on kelp followed. Rockfish populations in kelp-recovered zones climbed within years of otter arrival. Lingcod, umcabezon, and sheephead recolonized reefs that had been bare for decades. Harbor seals returned to haul-out sites adjacent to recovering kelp beds. Great white shark sightings increased in coastal zones where otter and seal populations were growing, predators tracking their prey up the recovered chain. James Estes, reviewing the California data alongside his Aleutian records, noted that the cascade appeared to operate through more trophic levels than any prior model had accounted for. The system was more deeply interconnected than even the scientists who believed in it had assumed. But the recovery did not unfold without resistance. As otter numbers rose, the commercial abalone and sea urchin fishing industries, both of which had grown and established infrastructure during the century of otter absence, began to feel the pressure. Catch volumes dropped in areas with expanding otter populations. Fishing associations filed formal complaints and pursued legal challenges. In 1987, the federal government implemented a management plan that designated a no-otter zone south of Point Conception, and wildlife officers were dispatched to capture and relocate any otter that drifted across the line. For 6 years, field teams attempted to maintain the boundary. In 1993, the program was officially declared unworkable and abandoned. The otters moved where the food was. A line drawn on a federal map did not register. By the 2000s, the political terrain had shifted. The question was no longer whether otters would exist on the California coast. They did, and the legal mechanisms to remove them had been exhausted. The question became how to manage fisheries in a coastline that was, as slowly and unevenly, returning to something closer to its pre-colonial state. The abalone fishery, meanwhile, had collapsed almost entirely, driven by a combination of urchin overgrazing in otter-free zones, a sea star wasting disease that decimated one of the urchin's few remaining predators, and warming ocean temperatures linked to successive marine heat waves. In some of the worst affected zones, researchers noted that areas with established otter populations showed greater kelp persistence through the heat events than adjacent otter-free zones. The animal that had been blamed for damaging the fishery appeared, in certain conditions, to be buffering the ecosystem against collapse. That nuance has not made the political argument simpler. It rarely does when an animal's recovery costs a human industry money. but the ecological record is what it is. 13 animals were placed into a dead estuary in 1984. 40 years later, the California sea otter population exceeds 3,000, and the kelp forests along significant stretches of the central coast are measurably recovering. Not because of any engineering program, not because of any management intervention, but because an animal that belonged there was put back. The urchin barren was never the problem. It was just what the coast looked like when one piece was missing.